to have this conversation, why don't we bring in John Rothmann? He was a longtime talk show host at KGO Radio before that station went away. He is a presidential historian. He is a political analyst. It is John Rothmann, everybody. Hi, John Rothmann.
Good morning. Happy to be with you. And Phil, welcome
Hey,
to the irascible Mark Thompson program.
Dinging it.
We love Mark Thompson. Mark Thompson is one of a kind.
That's right.
And we'll mark that down very carefully.
Nice. So the Times piece on Trump, he goes, I mean, they ask him about everything. It's funny because he was asked, was the article accurate? And he goes, he was pleased with it. It was 60% accurate. Okay, whatever. But he sits down with them, and it's a big deal because he hasn't given that many real interviews to real members of the media, right? We don't count, what is it, OAN? That doesn't count. We're talking real, legitimate.
Mainstream,
right.
Old school.
Thank you. People we can trust. At least that's where how I look at it. But he talks about and lays again the groundwork for the possibility that the election might be unfair, and doesn't really pull back on the possibility of violence breaking out after the election. Let's start there.
Well, it's a disgrace. And if I were in charge of the Democratic Party's campaign, I would be using that interview as fodder for the entire discussion about Donald Trump. But interestingly enough, I sat with somebody last night who is a Trump supporter, and we discussed what was the content of the Time magazine piece. And it made no difference. No difference. Their view of Donald Trump is very clear. He's better than Joe Biden. The Republican positions are better. And we understand there are deficiencies with Donald Trump, but we prefer him. And I think that is the ultimate tragedy. I believe that, as I say, if the Democrats were smart, they'd take that interview and just use it everywhere, because it discredits President Trump in a clear and precise fashion. The thing that scared me the most, and I want people to understand this, is when he became president in 2017, he didn't know the levers of power. He does now. But even scarier was a former Attorney General, Bill Barr, who served, I would remind you, under two presidents as Attorney General of the United States, George H.W. Bush and then Donald Trump. And even though Barr himself has expressed hesitations, he said he will support the Republican nominee for president.
They're doing this now. All of these people who were, came out against Trump after his presidency and were like, this was wrong, what happened? They're circling back around and they're getting back in line.
It's an unfortunate demise for the Republican Party that many of us knew growing up.
But John, this is what strikes me. Is there anything that will change Trump supporter or Biden supporters' minds at this point? I mean, ex-President Trump can do an interview in Time or wherever else and talk about these things that are outrageous, but people who love him are going to love him, and people that hate him are already going to hate him. I mean, what's going to change at this point?
The swing voters. The swing voters in this country, because...
But if you haven't made up your mind by now...
No, people do make up their mind at the last minute if there are events which overcome everything. Yeah. And I think your observation, if I may say so, Phil, about what happened on the campuses, it's a small group of people who protest and a small group of people who drive the attention of the media. We are blessed because Donald Trump is like a lightning rod. And every time he speaks out, I think it helps us. Now, let me be clear on the question of a woman's right to choose. By the way, to me, it's not a question of whether you're for or against an abortion. Question is, does a woman have a right to choose to control her own body? That's the way it ought to be defined. Look what's happening in Florida. I don't know how many people I know, women that I know, knew they were pregnant at 6 weeks.
No.
And I think these kinds of points are going to have a profound impact on us. The one thing I will observe that disturbs me is the memory of January 6th seems to have faded. The outrage that people felt has now receded. And I talked last night with two people, actually, about this question, and they were putting January 6th aside. And I explained, I cannot put January 6th aside. It was an assault on the very system which I believe has made America great. And so these are real issues that have to be confronted. The other thing, if I may quickly throw in, question of who Donald Trump will take as his running mate. It's going to have a huge impact in my mind. Remember, I've got to tell you, this is the last presidential campaign when I will be younger than both candidates for president. And what that means to me is that who is vice president is going to matter tremendously. And you think about
who do you think it's going to be?
It's a good question. If I were Donald Trump and I were going to take somebody, it would be Elise Stefanik, the number 3 Republican in the House leadership. She was once a moderate Republican, then became a Trumpster. I would avoid J.D. Vance, who is going to make an appearance tonight on CNN. I would avoid him with every way that I could because he is an election denier. But part of what we are going to be electing is not just a president, but we're going to be electing a vice president who will be critical, because whether Trump or Biden wins, they're both going to be in their 80s. And so it's a roll of the dice as to who the next president of the United States really will be in terms of succession.
So you talked about a lot of different topics there. Let me throw out reminders of what was covered in that Time magazine article. You mentioned abortion, and Trump apparently says, listen, it's up to the states, and it's okay if the states want to track women that are pregnant to make sure they don't get an abortion. So I guess pregnancy now means you're going to be surveilled, right? To make sure you complete from start to finish what they want you to do.
Yeah, it's shocking. And interestingly enough, one of the fellows I talked with yesterday said, well, it's a states' rights issue. And I'm thinking to myself, if in the 1950s, the South had prevailed following Brown versus the Board of Education, that was a states' rights issue. Mm-hmm. But the Supreme Court said at the time that Brown versus the Board of Education ruled that kind of segregation, that Jim Crow law is not legitimate in this country. The throwing out of Roe v. Wade was a disgrace. And I would remind everybody that in 2016, when he was running for president, Donald Trump assured us that he would nominate justices of the court that would rescind Roe v. Wade, and he succeeded. I think there's going to be a huge reaction among women. I agree with you, this whole thing of tracking. Well, last night, the discussion that I had, he said, well, Trump didn't say that. The reporter asked a question. Well, that's the problem with Donald Trump. By the way, he's also talking about withdrawing from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is
scary,
sending shivers up and down the spine of everybody. Look, you remember, you're too young to remember, but in 1952, what drove Eisenhower to run for president was that his major opponent for the nomination, Bob Taft, said he would withdraw from NATO. And Eisenhower said, we can't afford to do that. Yeah. There is an isolationist wing in the Republican Party. Look at what we had to do to get the House of Representatives to appropriate money for Ukraine. It's an absolute disgrace. And by the way, this is the other big story today. The Democrats are going to keep Speaker Johnson in power.
Yeah.
And that to me is also significant. They don't like Mike Johnson. They don't agree with him. By the way, he's an election denier. He's to the right of Attila the Hen on most issues, but they're going to keep him in power because I think that is going to be an important moment in drawing the contrast with Hakeem Jeffries, who I expect will be the next Speaker of the House of Representatives after the election. But there's so many aspects. Can you imagine having camps rounding people up for the purposes of deportation?
And to Trump supporters, that's red meat.
Yep, yeah. And that's why we have to point out that's not what America is all about.
Well, let me ask you. Let me ask you in your role as a presidential historian. I know this is a tough one, but how will history judge President Trump, whether he wins this next election or not?
I participate regularly in the writings McIver analysis of rating of the presidents. I am convinced that Donald Trump will rank at the bottom of every poll in the future. He certainly outranks James Buchanan, who traditionally is the worst judged president of the United States, president before Abraham Lincoln. Trump is, well, you know what amazed me? I thought there was a great line that Joe Biden used in his speech to the White House correspondents when he said, my vice president is for me.
Right. I've been endorsed by my vice president.
Yep. Trump's vice president isn't for him. And if I were the Democrats again, I would have all of these people who have been critical of Trump, who worked for him. Remember The Apprentice? You're fired?
Yeah.
Well, by gum, let them speak out. And if they won't speak, because a lot of them are afraid, I think they really are. There's a fear factor when you deal with Donald Trump. The one other thing that really
Fear of what?
Fear of retribution.
Yeah.
Fear of retribution, of what Trump is talking about in turning the Justice Department loose on his political enemies. May I tell you, I was very friendly with a fellow who wrote a book called The Plot That Failed. And Richard Nathan was a marvelous man. Richard Allen was a great guy. And in his book, he describes what Richard Nixon intended to do if Watergate had not interrupted. It's the same thing. The creation of an administrative presidency. And I urge people, just Google it, The Plot That Failed, take a look. This is a carbon copy. And the one thing I've learned about the Trump people is they're not very creative. But if you read the 2025 project, which is part of the Trump website, all you have to do is Google it. You can see that their plans to use the administrative presidency to really take over all of the levers of American government is one of the most horrifying things I have ever read in my life. And that has to be exposed as well. And it will be. The Democrats are going to use all this stuff.
So, it sounds like the garbage truck has arrived. So,
is that for you or for me?
I don't know. Yeah, start taking us away. I don't know. So, just a couple more things, just to, in case people hadn't.
If they put the brakes on, we can apply that to Donald Trump too.
Yeah, I wish we could, because for people that haven't read the article, just some of the things that were discussed. He said he would use the military, the National Guard, to deport immigrants that are not here legally. You talked about camps.
He talked about the National Guard, which is legal, but using the military is illegal.
Right.
But he did say that would be a last resort.
Yes, but a resort nonetheless.
Yeah.
Yeah, theoretically.
Yeah.
I think we're at this far down the road with Trump, you think people would understand that a lot of this is like rhetoric designed to inflame or impassion people and not really reality?
Is it hyperbolic? That's the question you're asking. And my answer is a clear one. If someone says they're going to come and kill you, believe them. The Israelis thought that Hamas had given up the idea of mass murder. All they had to do was read the covenant of Hamas. Mm-hmm. If a Jew should hide behind a rock or a tree, let the rock or the tree cry out, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Not an Israeli, but a Jew. And when people let their guard down because they think something is not going to happen or is incomprehensible, you have to remind them, if somebody says they're going to do something, proceed from the premise that they're going to do it. And I think that's the American lesson.
Can I ask a question, Kim?
Yeah, go please.
So I saw that you are a lifetime member. Correct me if I have the title wrong is it the American Zionist Association?
I was president of the Zionist Organization of America here in Northern California.
Zionist Organization of America. So when you see the hate and the for Jews on the campuses, almost as a separate issue from what's happening in Gaza, how are we supposed to process that?
Well, the Columbia University protest leader, and I listened to him, they've been repeating his stuff, said this, and I'll quote directly: Zionists don't deserve to live. I feel very comfortable calling for those people to die. Zionists, they're Nazis, they're fascists, they're supporters of genocide. Well, I'm a Zionist. I consider that a personal threat against my safety. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. A Jew is as entitled to national liberation as any other people. And I want to be very clear. That doesn't deny Palestinian rights. Palestinians have rights, but not at the expense of Israel's right to exist. And what the attack of October 7th demonstrated is that Jewish lives, to too many, don't matter. And so that's really my answer. Zionism is a legitimate national liberation movement. Do you remember in 1975, the United Nations passed a resolution equating Zionism with racism, and the world was outraged, absolutely furious. Nothing happened until December the 16th of 1991, when finally, for the first time and only time in its history, the United Nations rescinded that obscene resolution.
So
my answer is yes.
If John Rothmann is called by the head of Columbia or the head of USC or the head of UCLA or pick your school to mediate the ongoing protest between what's been described generally as pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel, and your job is to come in the middle of these two hateful groups, or when I say hateful, I mean hating each other, and try to broker a peace or foster an intelligent discussion. Is that possible, and how would you do it?
It isn't possible. I've been doing it. I've been working college campuses for 40 years. I've spoken on more than 150 college and university campuses throughout the United States and Canada. And I can tell you that mediation is very difficult. Let me explain to you. The Israelis have debated the question of a two-state solution. Some favor, some oppose, but it's a debate, a legitimate debate. And the Oslo Accords were designed to create a two-state solution. Hamas doesn't have a two-state solution. They have a one-state solution. And I asked my son Samuel, who is now in his 31 years old, when he was a little boy, I'd take him to all these rallies because I wanted him to be aware of every side of every issue. And they were chanting, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And Samuel, in all innocence, asked me, what is the river? What is the sea? What does it mean? I said, well, the river is the Jordan River. The sea is the Mediterranean Sea. And what's in the middle is Israel. And what that means is that Israel has no right to exist. 3 cheers for Joe Biden, who identified the slogan, called it out for what it is, and when they call for apartheid, Israel is an apartheid state, the answer is, of course, it's not an apartheid state. South Africa was an apartheid state. But the issue of genocide is also intriguing to me. These are not new terms. This is not new to the lexicon of the opponents of Israel. But let me, again, say clearly, if I were an Israeli and I wanted to commit genocide, they'd all be dead. They'd all be dead. They aren't. In fact, the Israelis have gone out of their way to try to keep people alive. So it's a curious phenomenon. But I've come to the conclusion that the great philosopher, the longshoreman, Eric Hoffer, was absolutely correct. And I knew him quite well. He lived here in San Francisco. And Hoffer once said, the problem with the world is they expect the Jews to be the only real Christians in the world. Well, the lesson of Jews since the Holocaust is you don't turn the other cheek. You cannot allow yourself to be slaughtered. And may I tell you, if only the protesters on the campuses would condemn what Hamas did on October 7th, if only part of their chant would be, release all the remaining hostages, 133 we are told, you hear not a word of that. So it's not that I'm against the Palestinians, quite the contrary. The Palestinians have to liberate themselves from the curse of Hamas and radical Islam.
Let's roll it back over to Trump, because yesterday, the judge in the New York criminal hush money trial finally enforces the gag order, right? And fines him a whopping $9,000 for reposting other people's material and whatnot. And what does Trump do? Well, he uses it as a platform to fundraise more money, just like he does with everything. Something bad happens, he's going to use it as a way to get people to give him stuff. And so I wanted your take on that. I mean, are you surprised that that's what he would do?
Donald Trump is not only in contempt of court and the gag order, he's in contempt of American democracy. And that has to be unmasked as well. Nothing surprises me with Donald Trump. Any guy who would hawk a Bible is, to me, a disgrace. So the answer really is, and in as short as I can make it, Donald Trump is the Elmer Gantry of American politics. He's willing to sell almost anything, and he has no ethics or morals at all. That's my view anyway.
In all caps on his Truth Social, he says, they want to silence me. They think they can bleed me dry, shut me up, but I'll never stop fighting for you, followed by a link to donate.
Of course.
I mean, yeah.
That's Donald Trump. But he's not fighting for other people.
No.
He's fighting for himself. He's the most selfish. But when you asked me the question, Phil, and it's a good question, about his ranking as a president of the United States, if you take a look at his overall years, people around him, what they thought of him, He's a disaster. By the way, that doesn't mean you don't give him credit for certain things. Talking about the Middle East, he deserves great credit, as does Jared Kushner, for the Abraham Accords. It was a real achievement. And there are many things that, and whenever I was on the air and, at KGO, most of our audience did not like Donald Trump very much. And whenever I would say something nice about Trump, boy, did I get it right in the, but it's okay, because there are things that presidents do with which I agree and things that I disagree. But I think when you deal with a Donald Trump, you have to weigh what he says, what he does, the people around him, and how do you vote for somebody who has now been held in contempt of a gag order?
Right.
How do you do that?
I was reading a story the other day about whether or not the publicity around the trial is a good thing for him. I mean, his name's constantly in the news. We're still talking about him. But the article I was reading was saying, listen, this isn't a good thing. It might seem like it is now, but the longer he sits at that defendant's table and the more information that comes out, it's not necessarily a positive. Like it's not any publicity is good publicity, right?
But he's not expanding his base.
Yeah.
What Donald Trump is doing is appealing to his base. And I believe, and maybe I'm wrong, we'll find out on November 5th, but I believe that a majority of the American people will reject the kind of antics offered by Donald Trump. And I think the proof is in the pudding on the issue of a woman's right to choose. Look, state after state are repudiating the Donald Trump position. On the issue of Ukraine and aid to Ukraine, a majority of Republicans favor aid to Ukraine. I listened the other day to Mitch McConnell, who is supporting the nominee of his party for president. That's how he puts it. It's no love affair with Donald Trump. But when Mitch McConnell was asked bluntly if Donald Trump fulfills his promise to prevent aid for Ukraine, and Mitch McConnell said, I'll fight him every inch of the way. And I think that's the key. We have to find the people who can stand up to Donald Trump and make their points. And I think that's going to be the key in this election.
Well, would that be Joe Biden? Or are you talking about Republicans?
It's a curious thing. The dislike of Joe Biden is great. Even greater is the ridicule heaped on him by Fox. By the way, I don't call it Fox News because that's an oxymoron. I think the portrayal of Joe Biden as a weak, indecisive, old man was belied by what he did at the White House Correspondents' Dinner or what he's done in his meetings with foreign leaders. I concede the fact that he's 81 years old. He's not 18. And I've had the privilege of knowing Joe Biden through the years. And I used to see him when he was a freshman senator, just starting out. Let me tell you, it was not the same Joe Biden as today. But I would rather have a diminished Joe Biden than a corrupt Donald Trump. And the other
that's how a lot of people view it.
Yeah.
Well, the other question is going to be, as I said earlier, we're not just voting for a president, we're going to vote for a vice president. And either way you look at it, both of these men will be over 80.
Speaking of vice presidents, Vice President Harris is largely considered an ineffective,
Yes,
to be polite, and a disaster to be impolite. Would you
so was
agree with
Harry
that
Truman.
analysis?
You know what they called Harry Truman? The senator from Pendergast. Or they'd make the joke, to err is Truman. Nobody thought he would measure up. And the 82 days he was vice president, nothing. And then he becomes one of the greatest presidents in American history. I've known Kamala Harris. I was the first radio talk show host to interview her before she was known to the public, before she was an elected public official. It was on sex trafficking and young girls. I have a high regard for her. And I think the ridicule, you know what we used to say about Dan Quayle? We used to say, we quail at the thought of his being president.
Well, the only reason I bring it up is because when I talk to people about the presidential race, a comment I hear over and over again is, this is the best we can do.
They're right.
Biden and Trump out of everyone in the country.
Right.
This is the best we can do?
They're right. That's what they said in 1932 between Roosevelt and Hoover.
Okay.
Roosevelt's a cripple and Hoover's a disaster. Is this the best we can do? History has a way of taking care of itself. And there's no question, if you know Kamala, she served here in San Francisco as district attorney. Then she was attorney general of California. She was a United States senator from California. She was then vice president of the United States. She has the experience. Nobody knows until they sit in the Oval Office what kind of president they will be. But when I contrast Kamala Harris's positions on issues, I am clear that she is better than any Republican. Now, let me be clear. I was a Republican. I don't know if you know my background, Phil, but I worked for Richard Nixon for many years. I was a liberal Republican. And as George Will once quipped, being a liberal Republican is a little bit like being a high church Unitarian. It's possible, but pointless. There is no Republican Party today that I would identify with. And by the way, I was a critic of Ronald Reagan's when he was governor of California. And I had no problem doing it because when Reagan did the things he did and what he said, I objected. But I believed that there was still hope in the Republican Party. The real question, it's a question we can't answer today, is when Donald Trump goes down to a crushing defeat, as I believe he will, and when the Republicans lose the Senate and the House, as I believe they will, what will the Republican Party do to rebuild it? It will have to be outside of the image of Donald Trump. And, you know, we talked about a Mike Pence. I never agreed with Mike Pence on anything, to be honest with you. And my wife's family's from Indiana, so I had a chance to watch him pretty carefully. If he hadn't been plucked to the vice presidential nomination, he would not have been reelected as governor. No question about it. But the simple truth is what Mike Pence represents is what remains of the Reagan Republican Party. And whether or not the Republican Party is willing to choose that path, unfortunately, most Americans don't remember Ronald Reagan. Most Americans don't remember Dwight Eisenhower. Most Americans just don't remember that far back. So the challenge after the election, if it goes as I hope it does, will be to rebuild the Republican Party and to rebuild it in an image which may still be conservative. But may I quickly point out to you, once upon a time, there was a liberal wing of the Republican Party and a conservative wing of the Democratic Party. And if you watch a bird fly, a bird needs two wings. You clip a wing, the bird can't fly. And what's happened in our American political system, in my judgment, is that the wings have been clipped. And so neither the Democrats, the Republicans can really fly. There's no reaching across the aisle as there used to be. And I think that is something that is sorely missing and which we have to rebuild. And I hope we do.
So we've talked about Trump and we talked about the protests on the college campuses. And here's a story that marries the two. Here's what we're going to be hearing coming up. The newest conspiracy theory. And this is Trump floating this theory that the pro-Palestinian protests on college university campuses are deliberately providing cover for an ongoing influx of immigrants. This is the latest. But you know what? He says it, and all of a sudden it's everywhere. It's good to know that it's not true, right?
Well, let me be clear. We have always had on college campuses, and I've been working the campuses, I hate to say it, since the late 1960s. And we've always had a group, a small group, but a measured group that was very pro-Palestinian, pro-anti-Israel. I have a collection of materials I've put together over the years from the campuses. There also were Jews who were very devoted to building the future of Israel. They were also a small group. What I've learned is that 10% of campuses are pro-Palestinian, 10% are pro-Israel, but the rest of them don't have an opinion. And I think one of the things which we have to be very mindful of is these current demonstrations, I think, are alerting people to the danger of this kind of extremism. And it has to be pointed out repeatedly.
I don't even know where does he get this stuff?
Well, where does he get all of his stuff?
Exactly.
Well, I mean, this particular one is,
but
by his standards, is out
all
there.
of it. I mean, how do you? Here's a man who is convicted of having assaulted a woman. Here's a man who is in a public court cited for contempt.
Right. But you know what the supporters say is like, well, we understand that he has some personality flaws,
It's a cult.
but we think we like his policies. We
It's a
like what he's
cult.
done for the country. I
It's a
mean,
cult.
Kim, after the Access Hollywood tape came out,
That should have been it.
I'm saying, how can any woman
You're right.
vote for that man after that tape came out?
It shocks me to this very day. To this very day, it should have been it. And in any other presidential campaign, he would have been out. Like, that would have been the October surprise, and it would have been a done deal.
That's because his followers, not all, but most, follow whatever he says. You want the latest news on Ukraine? Listen to Donald Trump. You want the latest news on the emerging crisis, which you'll be dealing with later with our climate crisis? Ask Trump. And I think that's the problem.
Well, that's like having state news, right? I mean, that's like China and Russia, where the supreme leader gets to decide exactly what the news forecast is for the night. No.
That's what Time Magazine's interview indicates. He wants to be the final arbiter. And even as with Richard Nathan and the plot that failed with Richard Nixon, the plot of Donald Trump, and I urge everybody to take a look at the 2025 project, the plot must fail. But it only fails if we speak out. And look, I'm not a news person. I've never been a news person. I'm a radio talk show host. And I've always expressed my views without any hesitation or doubt. And I do it without fear. And I think that's another problem. You have people who are really afraid of Donald Trump.
Yeah. To Phil's point, Karen writes, women have to vote en masse. It's not just their rights, it's potential for millions of people in segments of society to lose rights. It's true. It's not just the offensive nature of his comment on Access Hollywood. I mean, that's offensive and it goes to character, right? But as you were talking about earlier, John, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. If they tell you they're going to try to take away their rights, if they show you that they've taken away your right, your rights to reproductive freedom, expect that more and more and more of the things they do will go down that same garden path. So I believe it.
Phil made a very good point, and that is the question between Biden and Trump. The demonization of Joe Biden, the ridicule heaped on Joe Biden is very disturbing. And one of the arguments made to me last night is, well, Biden won't live out his term.
Yeah.
And, it's a choice we have to make because we only have two. We haven't talked about the third party candidacies, particularly Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a crank. He's really a nutcase.
Who will he take votes away from?
I think more from Trump.
You do.
And some of the polls are indicating that now. And the reason is because it's the conspiracy theory people who follow that path. The Biden people are not conspiracy theory people. But look at Kennedy's running mate, who basically bought the place on the ticket and who is also a vaccine denier. These things have to be exposed. But the danger, and you're right to point it out, Phil, the danger is that in a third-party candidacy, when you ask who will take away the most votes, did you hear Jill Stein the other night? I watched Jill Stein on CNN. She was the one who really was decisive in Hillary Clinton's losing campaign. Jill Stein is an anti-Zionist. Her words about Israel were absolutely appalling. But most people don't watch the news. They don't listen to the interviews. They don't read Time Magazine. They don't hear Jill Stein or others who pull this kind of stuff. We have to expose it. Now, you're in the news business. I'm not in the news business. I'm a radio talk show host. So my job, when I'm on the air and when I'm lucky enough to be on the program that we're doing now with Kim and Mark, is to expose these kinds of things. But here's a question for you. You're in broadcasting as I am. I've spent, over 30 years in broadcasting. Question is, who listens to podcasts? Are there enough people listening? And you asked a question before we went on the air about interaction. The joy that I took from going into the studio and interacting with my audience was tremendous. We have a hard time interacting on a podcast. And the limitations in terms of what's happened to talk radio. San Francisco, the fourth largest market in the nation, has no talk radio station, zero. So I sat with a group of investors and I said to them, okay, let's buy an AM station. And you know what their answer was? No. Why? Because you can't turn a profit. The advertisers aren't there anymore. Running a station is a phenomenally costly situation. Even running a podcast. That's why, and I always put in the plug, support the Mark Thompson show. And you'll put something up, Albert, so people know where to go to support it. Because unless people want this, it's not going to succeed. And in a sense, it destroys the very essence of that interaction, which is so necessary.
We'll wrap it up with this comment from Wren. She says, I think Trump's popularity comes from the same origin as Reagan's. The country idolizes and bows to celebrity, no matter what. Is there a way to overcome that? Is there a way that your celebrity becomes less important than who you are as a candidate and as a person?
In this market, at this time, I'm afraid that if you're a celebrity, you get a lot of credit just for being a celebrity.
Yeah.
I very seriously considered running for mayor of San Francisco. I chose in the end not to run in this campaign. And I know you're going to interview Mark Farrell shortly on the program.
We actually already have. We interviewed him last week. Yeah, he was great.
Yeah, but the point I'm making is when people came to me, they said, John, you've been on the radio for 3 decades. People of San Francisco know you. They trust you. They know you're a straight shooter. That's why they wanted me to run. And that's what The Apprentice did for Donald Trump. It was entertainment, but he appeared to be a straight shooter. You're fired. It had that sense. To run a campaign today, look at what Adam Schiff has had to raise to run for the United States Senate.
It's wild.
I think it'll be the most expensive Senate seat in the country. And he's going to win because there's no question about it now. But look at all the money spent simply to secure a nomination. The days when you could run from nowhere. May I just make the observation? Do you realize that 2 major American politicians, Wendell Willkie in 1940 and Adlai Stevenson in 1952, ran as dark horse candidates? That is to say, they came to the convention and were able to be nominated without having really run in primaries. They hadn't done anything. Those days are gone. If something happened to Donald Trump tomorrow, or something happened to Joe Biden tomorrow, the delegates elected, and they are elected, would have a real problem. Who will they vote for? I always remember when Bobby Kennedy was killed, and the Kennedy delegates, not enough to win the nomination, but a force, got together and decided to back George McGovern, who didn't have a chance of winning the nomination. But the delegates themselves asserted their principles. What would happen? Very seriously, if something happened between now and the conventions to Trump or Biden, who makes the selection? The running in a primary is no longer a factor. And by the way, there are no more bosses to dictate and to make deals at a convention. So the American political system is in danger. And that's why the health and welfare of both candidates for president, if that's who the parties want. But now let me give you one other example. Let's assume Donald Trump is really convicted. And let's assume that in some way the trial about January 6th takes place. It isn't going to, but what if it did? He would still have the elected delegates to claim the nomination for the presidency of the United States. The delegates don't have free will. They don't have the ability to do as in the old days in the smoke-filled rooms to make those kinds of decisions. And as long as we use this process, we are in a sense captive of what we try to do when many supported the democratization of the political party system. Remember, the last person nominated for president of the United States who did not run in any primaries was Hubert Humphrey in 1968. And in that convention, where you had Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern, because Bobby Kennedy was gone, Lyndon Johnson pulled the strings. The Democratic Party was still a powerful party. Does anybody care what the Democratic Party chairman says? Does anybody care what the Republican Party chairman says? Do you even know who they are? I mean, there is a weakness within our system. And may I tell you, I really mean this. I pray assiduously that we will not have a vacancy with Trump or Biden, because the American political process would have a real problem before the conventions in coming to a conclusion. Yeah. So I throw this out just for your prayerful consideration, because there are real issues that have to be confronted, not only in terms of where candidates stand. But one other quick point, I know we're running out of time, but you have to understand, I'm like any slightly egomaniacal radio talk show host. I never know how to stop. They once gave me an award in high school, the award of the spigot. Once turned on, John could not be turned off.
There he goes.
But
yes.
I think it's just important to consider this particular process that we are in now and what it means for the future of American politics.
John Rothmann, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Every Wednesday, we get to hang out and visit with you. So we'll see you next week.
Yes. And Phil, it was a great privilege to be able to participate with you. And all I can say is you have no idea how lucky you are to be co-anchoring with the incredible, incomparable Kim McAllister.
Nice to meet you. Enjoyed talking with you.
All right.
Thanks, John.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.